Everyone's heard it, mate. Rent is dead money. Every dollar you give your landlord is supposedly a dollar you could have put into your own home. Sounds pretty obvious, right? Sounds like common sense. But there's actually a mistake almost everyone makes when they compare renting and buying, and honestly, that one mistake can completely flip the answer. We'll get to that in a minute because once you see it, you probably won't look at a mortgage repayment the same way again. So let's make this real. Imagine we've got two Australians, both starting with $150,000 saved, both earning pretty similar incomes, both living in Brisbane, and both looking at the exact same $750,000 home. Person A decides to buy it, while person B decides to keep renting and invest the difference instead. And for the next few minutes, we're basically going to follow these two people and see where they actually end up. Now first, let's look at what buying really costs. Person A puts that $150,000 down as a deposit and takes out a $600,000 mortgage. At current rates, that's roughly $857 a week in repayments. But here's the thing, mate, that weekly repayment is only part of the story. You've also got stamp duty, which in Queensland on a $750,000 purchase is around $21,000, plus legal and conveyancing fees, building and pest inspections, possibly lender's mortgage insurance if the deposit is under 20%, home insurance, council rates, and then all the maintenance that comes with actually owning the place. And here's something worth keeping in mind, because it sounds a bit weird at first. A mortgage repayment isn't entirely a housing cost. I know that sounds strange, but we'll come back to exactly why that matters in a second. Now look at person B, the renter. A comparable property in the same area rents for around $670 a week, which works out to about $34,840 a year. Then you've got the bond, moving costs, and the fact that rent tends to creep up over time. So that's the renter's side of the equation. But person B has something person A doesn't. That original $150,000 hasn't disappeared into a house. It's still there and they can actually put it to work. So where does that $150,000 go? For person A, it becomes equity in the property, basically money tied up in bricks and mortar. For person B, let's say they put it into a diversified investment portfolio, maybe shares or index funds, something that's historically produced positive long-term returns, although obviously there's no guarantee and markets can go up and down pretty sharply. And this is where things get interesting because we're still not actually comparing these two options properly. Not even close. Let's look at the scoreboard after year one. Person A has made 52 weeks of mortgage repayments, paid off a small amount of the principal, covered their insurance and rates, and for this example, let's say the property has gone up 4% over the year. That's roughly $30,000 of growth on paper. Person B has paid $34,840 in rent, and if we assume a 7% return just for illustration, their $150,000 investment has made around $10,500. So at first glance, it looks like person A is winning. But honestly, at this point, you could make a pretty convincing argument for either side. And that's exactly why comparing these numbers the way people normally do can be misleading. Remember that mistake I mentioned at the start? This is where it comes in. One of the biggest mistakes people make is comparing the rent directly against the entire mortgage repayment. They see $857 a week going out on the mortgage and $670 going out on rent, and they think, well, buying costs $187 more a week. Done, buying's more expensive. Except that's not really what's happening. Here's the important bit. That $857 weekly mortgage repayment isn't one single expense. Part of it is interest, which is the actual cost of borrowing the bank's money, and part of it is principal, which reduces the amount you owe and builds equity in the property. So when person A hands over that $857, some of it is a genuine cost that's gone forever, just like rent. But the rest is basically moving money from their bank account into an asset they own. And that's the bit people often miss. A mortgage repayment is really a housing cost plus a forced savings component bundled into the same number. Person B doesn't get that home equity, obviously, but they keep something else that's pretty valuable: flexibility. Their money stays liquid and can be invested wherever they think makes sense. So now, if we actually compare these two properly, on the buying side you've got the interest, which is the true borrowing cost, the upfront buying costs, ongoing maintenance, and all the other ownership expenses. But you've also got property growth, principal repayments building equity, and the leverage that comes from controlling a $750,000 asset with a $150,000 deposit. On the renting side, you've got the rent obviously, but you've also got whatever return that invested $150,000 generates, plus flexibility, liquidity, no maintenance headaches, and no buying or selling costs eating into the numbers. Once you break it down like that, you start to see why there isn't one universal answer. It really comes down to what the property does, what the investment does, and what happens over the years that follow. So let's fast forward to year 5 because this is where the story can really start to change. If property prices rise at a healthy rate, buying can pull ahead, sometimes by quite a lot, because person A's gains are based on the full $750,000 property, not just the $150,000 they originally put in. But if property prices stay roughly flat, the gap between buying and renting can get a lot smaller, and suddenly discipline starts to matter a lot more. And if property prices fall while the share market performs well, renting and investing can genuinely come out ahead. Then you've got rising rents to throw into the mix and the whole picture changes again. The longer you run this experiment, the more the assumptions start deciding the result. And that's really the point. Now let's talk about leverage, because this is one of the biggest reasons property can build so much wealth over time. Person A controls a $750,000 asset using $150,000 of their own money. If that property goes up 10%, that's $75,000 of growth, not $15,000. That's the power of leverage, mate, and it's a huge reason property has created so much wealth for Australians over the years. But there's a catch, obviously. Leverage works both ways. If that same property falls 10%, that's a $75,000 drop against a $150,000 deposit. That's effectively a 50% hit to their original capital. So leverage doesn't just make the good times bigger, it makes the bad times bigger too. Now let's give renting a fair go, because renting has some very real advantages. You've got liquidity, you've got flexibility, you can move for a job, relationship, or just because you want to change without having to sell a property and pay all those selling costs. You can also diversify instead of having a huge chunk of your wealth tied up in one property in one suburb. You've got lower upfront costs, and importantly, you're not the person getting the call when the hot water system decides to give up on a Sunday morning. But there's one condition that can make or break the whole renting strategy. You actually have to invest the difference. If person B pockets the difference between their rent and what a mortgage might cost, and then spends it on holidays, eating out, and lifestyle stuff, the mathematical advantage of renting basically disappears. Renting only really works as an investment strategy if you're disciplined enough to actually invest the money you're saving. You've probably heard people say that you need to own a property for 5 to 7 years before buying becomes worthwhile. But honestly, it's not some magic rule. The longer you're likely to stay, the more those upfront costs like stamp duty and legal fees get spread across the years you're actually living there. And if you eventually sell, you've also got selling costs like agent commissions to think about. So the actual break-even point depends on property growth, rent growth, your mortgage rate, and what kind of return you could realistically get from the alternative investment. There isn't one number that works for everyone. So who should probably lean towards buying? Maybe someone with a stable income, a pretty clear idea that they're going to stay in the same place for a long time, repayments that are comfortable rather than absolutely maxed out, a solid emergency fund, and enough breathing room that one unexpected expense doesn't completely wreck the budget, and who might lean more towards renting. Someone whose career or location could change, someone who doesn't know where they'll be in a few years, someone for whom buying would mean living paycheck to paycheck, and someone who genuinely has an investment plan for the money they're not putting into the house. And probably most importantly, they've actually got the discipline to stick to that plan. So is rent dead money? Not necessarily, mate. And is buying always the smarter move? Definitely not. The real question was never just whether $670 of rent is cheaper than an $857 mortgage repayment every week. The real question is what happens to every dollar you put into each option over the next 5, 10, or 20 years. Buying gives you forced equity and the potential benefit of leverage. Renting gives you flexibility and liquidity, but you only get the full benefit if you actually invest what you're saving. Neither option is automatically the winner. It really comes down to your income, your timeline, the market you're in, and honestly, your own discipline. And that's probably the biggest takeaway here. Don't just ask, is rent cheaper than a mortgage? Ask what each dollar is actually doing for you over time. If this changed the way you look at the rent versus buy debate, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one, mate.